when I had this idea to do a YouTube channel, and I called it "Digging Deeper with Dan." And I thought of different things that I'd be digging deeper with. But this video is not meant tonight for comedy. It's not meant for your entertainment. I've got something on my mind that I was going to let go because that's what I usually do after I calm down after a situation has passed. But I'm finding out firsthand that this is happening on a regular basis, and we as a family are faced with it again. And you'll notice that I'm looking down. I've written down some notes because I want to make sure that I say what I need to say here tonight as I make this video. When my mother was first hospitalized in March, Monica and I were there to advocate for her and answer questions for the doctors. Often, Mum couldn't remember details regarding her recent health complications, so she needed someone to be there to help with those details. As many of you know, Mum did pass away on March the 6th. We were able to be with her in her room for her final 6 days, 24 hours a day. Since March, we've been faced with a lot of changes because of COVID-19. One of the more difficult ones is that when a loved one is hospitalized, there are some strict policies regarding family and visitation, etc. Here's what we've learned recently. When a loved one is taken to hospital by ambulance, you can't go with them unless they're a minor. Our son Will was hurt early in the summer in our backyard, and we called EMS due to the amount of blood loss from a cut in his foot that required 9 stitches. He was transported by ambulance to the hospital, treated and released, and had to phone me for a ride home. We were not allowed into the ER to be with him. He's 18. Will's able to speak for himself and explain what happened to the doctors. Move forward a little bit more to July the 8th at 2 a.m. when my father was taken to hospital from his long-term care facility for low oxygen issues, a problem precipitated by a previous condition. Now, I had spoken to staff members in his long-term care facility earlier in the evening, and they had been keeping me posted on his condition. I'd spoken to Dad earlier as well, who was barely able to talk. Dad's care facility considered his situation critical, so that's why they called EMS. Now, something that you should know is that 3 days after Mom's funeral, visiting restrictions were put into place at all long-term facilities, and we were not allowed into Dad's home to visit him. I talked to him every day, at least once, often more than once, just to see how he was doing. Trying to be there for him the best that we could, just having lost Mom. In May, his long-term facility started to allow visits through the window of the dining room by appointment. He'd have a cell phone, and we'd talk to him through the window using his cell phone and talking to him on my cell phone. We hadn't been in the same room as Dad since March the 13th. Mom's funeral was just a few days earlier. So now, here we are in July. He's being taken to hospital. Now, since current COVID restrictions didn't allow us to go to the hospital, I contacted the emergency department. And this is where the rest of this story begins. I contacted the emergency department numerous times and was transferred to an extension that never answered and did not have voicemail. And the person answering the phone, likely at the desk when you first go into emergency, knew nothing other than the fact that my father was a patient there. After 12 hours of not having any verbal contact from medical staff at the hospital, I drove to the ER wearing my mask to get answers. I was met at the door by a volunteer and hospital security who would take your info and tell you that you couldn't go in, especially to the ER. If your loved one is in a ward, you can get in by prearranged appointment only. After some strong words from me, security let me into the waiting room of the ER. A phone call was made, and eventually a social worker came out to talk to me about Dad. and as a non-medical staff member gave me only basic information, a social worker. Still not satisfied, I pushed harder and said that when Dad was brought in by EMS, he was considered critical by his doctor and the nurses at his long-term care facility. To which the social worker answered, if he was considered critical when he arrived, we would have phoned you. So I had to wait 12 hours to be told that by a social worker. I had to wait 12 hours for that. I eventually got a call a few hours later from a doctor who asked me a lot of questions regarding Dad's history. That was at least 14 hours after he arrived. I was told that they were trying to stabilize Dad's oxygen levels and get him to his baseline levels. I asked, when is the turning point when the decision would be made that Dad would be considered palliative? Are we in this situation? My family wanted to know. I have brothers, one in Hamilton, one in Georgia. My own family, we all wanted to know what was going on with Dad. If he's made palliative, then we would be allowed in to see him at that point, because his time at that point is limited. And the doctor's answer was, we're not there yet. So over the course of the next 48 hours, we were not allowed in to see Dad, and he was eventually transferred to a ward late Thursday evening. He'd been brought in 4 a.m. Wednesday morning. Now, the visitation rules in the ward, there are visitations allowed. But if your room number is odd, then you get to go in and visit on the odd calendar days. If your room number is even, then you get to go in and visit your loved one on the even numbered calendar days. And the visit had to be prearranged and had to be on the security master list that was down at the front entrance to the hospital when you arrived. If you weren't on that list, you weren't going in. And you were only allowed 2 visitors per family member per day, one at a time. Not only that, you weren't even allowed to go in together. So you weren't even allowed to come to the hospital together. I wanted to bring my brother down to come see Dad. He wasn't allowed to come in with me to the hospital. We would have had to go in at a different time, and I would have had to leave the building. So anyway, it was late on July the 9th when he was transferred to the ward. So July the 9th, number 9 is odd. His room was odd. So we weren't permitted to go in because it was late at night. Now the next day is even, so we're not going to be allowed in then either. He still wasn't listed as palliative. So the next time that we would be allowed in to see him was Saturday, July the 11th. This was still Thursday. I talked to the doctor a couple of times and was given updates that they were still trying to get his oxygen levels to his baseline, to get him back to his baseline so they could send him back to his long-term care facility. I talked to the ward nurses 4 times throughout Friday for various updates. At one point, Dad was a little bit more alert, and I made arrangements through the ward for my brother and I to see Dad on Saturday, and we were put on the official guest list to be able to come into the hospital and visit, but we had to do it separately. I made my final call to the nurses for Friday at 11:30 p.m. And the nurse told me that when I arrived in the morning that I should contact the doctor and insist that Dad be listed as palliative so that we could come in anytime. She didn't like the look of the situation as far as the condition that my father was in. She continued with what she was telling me, and she said that his oxygen levels weren't staying up to where they should be. So I thanked her for the info, and I asked her to call me if his condition changed. This was the first nurse that we had that was actually willing to have a conversation with me and tell me straight what was going on. So I asked her to call me if anything changed. This was 11:30 at night on Friday. At 4 a.m., she called me and said that we needed to come down, that Dad had maybe an hour left of his life. Monica and I went right away and held Dad's hand until he died just after 5 a.m. So I guess he was palliative. Due to COVID-19, this was the first time that we'd been in the same room as my dad since March 13th. Now, I understand that there need to be restrictions because of COVID-19, but unlike my mother, we weren't able to be there for Dad. We weren't able to be there when the ambulance arrived to answer the doctor's questions at the hospital. Dad was 89 years old and had conditions that made his recovery chances low. He was in a lot of pain for various reasons, and his quality of life was slipping drastically. Mom had died 128 days earlier. Dad was ready to go. But Dad should not have had to spend his last few days alone, without family, and no one to speak to him or no one to speak for him. And the last call I get is that he has an hour left. I'm sorry. Moving to tonight, and we're dealing with this crap again. Monica's mom was rushed to hospital, and once again, family was not allowed to attend. We phoned to get information and are told that the nurses are in with her and that they are waiting for the doctor and they'll be running tests. Monica's brother, who is a nurse, called and got minimal questions answered, but when Monica called a while later, and she was greeted by the same nurse that her brother spoke to, the conversation was less friendly. The nurse was quite annoyed, actually, and she was very short with Monica. And like we've been told before, because of privacy rules, they can't tell you much over the phone. This policy of not being able to tell much over the phone has been in place since before COVID-19 restrictions, because we used to get that when we called for my dad when he was in the hospital 2 years ago. We're not allowed to be at the hospital when it's important for us to be there, but they won't answer the questions that the family wants answered over the phone. Again, a situation where it would be helpful for doctors and for Monica's mom if someone was there that knows her history and can answer questions. We don't know how serious the situation is here. So if you're part of this family, part of Monica's family, part of Mark's family, please private message or on Facebook or text message Monica to get details as to how she is, because by the time this video comes out, we may know more. When Rob spoke to the hospital the last time, he heard the nurse say to the doctor that she needed to speak to the family, that we had phoned 3 times, to which the doctor answered to the nurse that Mark was being admitted. The nurse told her that the doctor needed to tell us that. I know this video is long, but I'm beyond frustrated with the current state of affairs. Now, please understand that I'm not against restrictions being put in place due to COVID-19, and that's not a debate that I'm willing to get into. Having worked in a hospital as an environmental aide, I completely understand the necessity of cleanliness and infection control. As inconvenient and difficult the restrictions were, they were necessary, and we firmly believe that those restrictions kept the numbers of cases of COVID-19 to a minimum in my dad's facility, limited only to staff. Only staff got COVID-19 where my dad lived. No residents contracted COVID-19, and quite possibly extended my dad's life, as he was of extremely high risk. For that, we're thankful. What I have a problem with is the hospitals. Yes, there need to be restrictions for non-patients, family of patients. Not everybody follows the rules. People like to do things their own way. And yes, COVID-19 could be spread through a hospital. But who's there for an older family member? Who is there to answer the doctor's questions? Who's there to advocate for care when they can't? And who in the hospital is there to answer your questions when you call to find out what you need to know about your family member? The answer to all of this is no one. We can't be there, and no one's answering our questions. Somebody, somewhere, needs to make some changes. Something needs to change. COVID-19 isn't going anywhere anytime soon. Hospitals in Ontario and maybe other places, and I can't speak for other provinces, but Ontario hospitals need to change how they care for patients who can't advocate for themselves. Right now, unless your loved one is deemed critical and not expected to survive, you're not allowed as a family member in the emergency department with them. When you call the ER for info, you should not be greeted with some grumpy nurse that can't answer your questions and doesn't want to talk to you because they're too busy. They have a lot of patients. We get that. We understand that. But no one's willing to answer your questions when you call. No one who is brought to the hospital who, for whatever reason, can't answer important questions regarding their own health should be left alone. And family members should not have to sit at home for 12 hours or more without answers about their family member. And no one, sure as hell, should not get a call an hour before your family member dies to say that you should probably come to the hospital because time's running short. When until then you were led to believe that your family member was not considered palliative by doctors. There needs to be a point of contact. Someone or two someone's with sole responsibility is to answer phone calls from family members and be informed. And just there to inform the family of the situation. There should be people in place that establish a line of communication between the doctor and family. Everybody is using Zoom these days because of the circumstances. Why can't there be someone who travels with the doctor to establish a Zoom call or phone call with family to answer questions when the doctor needs to know things? If we can't be there, then make it possible and easy for the doctor to talk to the family when necessary. Well, hospital policies don't allow for information to be shared by phone. Change that. Find a way. Recently, I've had to do some legal stuff that required a lawyer to be involved, involving my mom's estate and some paperwork that my father had to sign. Usually you do that kind of thing in person. The lawyer would go to my dad and get them signed. But they've adapted. Because of COVID-19, Dad's signature was witnessed on a video call by the lawyer while staff at the long-term care facility gave him the paperwork, gave him the pen, and told him where to sign. Long-term care facilities are adapting, and they're doing a fabulous job. It's time hospitals did the same. Hospital administration needs to improve the lines of communication from the emergency department to the family of patients and from the wards to the patients, from the wards to the family members and from the doctors to the family members. In a time of medical need or crisis in a family, the last thing you need is to have to fight, and I mean fight, to be there for your loved ones when they need you the most. You shouldn't have to get into an argument on the phone just to find out how your loved one is. You shouldn't have to poke and prod just to get answers. Something needs to change. Yeah, this is probably a bit of a rant, but if you've made it to the end of this video, thank you for indulging me. Please feel free to share this with someone that maybe can make that change. And if you've got loved ones in the hospital yourself, I pray for you and your family that you don't have to deal with this the way that we have.